I drove 9 hours to my sister's luxury mountain wedding, expecting only to be politely ignored. Instead, the coordinator checked her tablet and whispered, "Right this way." She escorted me away from the main hall. My assigned seat was a single white folding chair squeezed beside a linen cart and the women's restroom door. I had no glassware, just a cocktail napkin and a cheap label marking the exact moment my blind loyalty finally died. My name is Amanda Winters, and for 34 years, I have made a quiet living out of being invisible. Professionally, I work as an environmental graphic designer for Northline Civic Media up in Minneapolis. My job is to dictate how people move through spaces, where their eyes land, and how a room makes them feel without them ever noticing the design itself. I build structures meant to be overlooked while ensuring everything functions perfectly. It is a fitting career for a woman who has spent her entire life playing the exact same role within her own family. When my sister Sloane announced her wedding to Nolan Pierce, I packed my car and drove 9 hours south to a luxury mountain estate just outside Asheville, North Carolina. I did not expect a place of honor. I did not expect a heartfelt toast or a tearful sisterly embrace in the bridal suite. I fully anticipated being placed at a distant table with second cousins or awkward coworkers. At worst, I believed I would be politely ignored, allowed to eat my catered meal in peace, and then slip away before the dancing began. The venue was an architectural masterpiece of reclaimed wood and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched on a ridge that overlooked a vast, sweeping valley. The ceremony was, undeniably, breathtaking. The late afternoon sun filtered through the ancient pines, casting a golden hue over the rows of white wooden chairs. When Sloane walked down the aisle, the string quartet played a modern composition that swelled perfectly with her every step. She looked radiant, composed, and undeniably powerful. Sitting in the fourth row, behind aunts and uncles and people I hardly recognized, I felt my defenses lower. For a fleeting, foolish moment, the complicated history between us dissolved. I watched my sister exchange vows with Nolan, a man whose wealth was matched only by his tailored perfection, and I felt genuine tenderness. My throat tightened. I smiled, wiping a stray tear from my cheek. She was my sister, after all. Perhaps, I told myself, a wedding was exactly the kind of monumental shift that could reset the fractures in our family. That fragile tenderness vanished entirely the moment I reached the reception hall. The cocktail hour was a blur of clinking champagne flutes and the low hum of expensive conversations. Guests were gradually migrating toward a massive, ornate, gold-framed mirror leaning against a wall of white roses. A calligrapher had meticulously painted the seating assignments across the glass in looping, silver script. The aesthetic was flawless. I stood patiently near the back of the crowd, waiting for the throng of tulle and tailored suits to part so I could find my table number. When the space cleared, I stepped up to the mirror. I scanned the alphabetical columns. I found the P section. Noting the prominent placement of Nolan's extended family, I moved my eyes down to the W section. Wallace, Weaver, Whitman, there was no Winters. Amanda. I blinked, assuming I had skipped a line. I read the section again, slower this time. I checked the A section, just in case they had sorted by first names. Nothing. A cold, sharp stone of panic settled in the bottom of my stomach. I stepped back, letting another couple take my place, and took a slow, deep breath. I told myself it was merely an administrative oversight. Sloane had fired her first wedding planner and hired a new team only 2 months ago. Mistakes happen in the transition. I am a problem solver. This was merely a problem to be solved. I caught sight of a young woman in a sharp black suit standing near the arched entryway, a clipboard in one hand and an illuminated tablet in the other, an earpiece curled around her ear. She possessed the tense, hyper-alert posture of a wedding coordinator trying to keep a multi-million-dollar event on schedule. I approached her with a polite, deferential smile. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low so as not to disturb the arriving guests. "It seems my name was left off the seating mirror. Amanda Winters. I am the bride's sister." The coordinator offered a polished, practiced smile. "Of course, Miss Winters, let me just check the master list. Sometimes the calligrapher runs out of space on the glass. She tapped the screen of her tablet. Her manicured finger scrolled down, then stopped. I watched her face. I saw the exact moment her professional composure fractured. Her eyes widened slightly, darting from the screen to my face, then back to the screen. A flush of pink crept up her neck. She did not say, "Oh, here you are." She did not say, "There has been a terrible mistake." Instead, she swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "Right this way, Miss Winters." She did not lead me into the grand ballroom where the chandeliers dripped with crystal and the tables were draped in heavy crushed velvet. She turned sharply and walked toward the perimeter of the room. I followed, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood, the sound quickly drowned out by the rising volume of the jazz band warming up. We bypassed the elegant circular tables. We bypassed the long, rustic farm tables designated for the wedding party. We kept walking until the lighting changed from warm and atmospheric to harsh and fluorescent. She led me into a narrow overflow corridor. It was a transitional space, a backstage artery designed purely for utility. On my left was a pair of heavy wooden doors with small rectangular windows, meant for the catering staff to swing through with hot plates. To my right was a large, polished brass sign bolted to the wall, an arrow pointing down the hall beneath the words, "Ladies' Restroom." The air here smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner and the heavy yeasty scent of warming bread from the kitchen. The coordinator stopped. She gestured rigidly with one hand, unable to meet my eyes. "Here is your seat, Miss Winters," she murmured, before turning on her heel and vanishing back into the glow of the reception. I stood alone in the corridor and looked at the space they had prepared for me. There was no table. There was no centerpiece. Squeezed tightly between a towering, canvas-sided linen cart and the brass restroom sign was a single, white, padded folding chair. Through the arched opening that led back to the main room, I could see the other guests taking their seats. I could see the tall, dramatic floral arrangements. I could see the thick, textured cardstock of the printed menus tucked perfectly into the folded napkins. I could see the customized place cards, the heavy silverware, the 3 distinct crystal glasses set at every single position. My spot had only the folding chair. Resting squarely in the center of the white vinyl seat cushion was a single, flimsy paper cocktail napkin. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The cruelty of it was so precise, so calculated, that for a moment, my brain simply refused to process the visual information. I tried to find a logical explanation. Perhaps they needed an extra chair for a vendor. Perhaps the real table was missing a chair, and this was just a staging area. Then I stepped closer. Taped to the top of the curved plastic backrest was a piece of white tape. It was not the elegant, silver calligraphy from the mirror. It was a standard, harsh white label, the kind a florist uses to mark a delivery box or a caterer uses to label a tray of dietary restrictions. Written on it, in thick black permanent marker, was my name, Amanda Winters. The sick, metallic taste of clarity flooded my mouth. This was not a logistical error. This was not an oversight caused by a panicked wedding planner. A mistake is forgetting to print a place card. A mistake is accidentally seating someone with the wrong family. This was architectural. This was deliberate. Someone had to acquire this specific chair. Someone had to carry it out of a storage closet. Someone had to place it exactly between the dirty linens and the bathroom door. Someone had to write my name on a vendor tag and tape it down. They had planned this. Sloan had planned this. I had spent my whole life being useful to them, swallowing my pride, fixing their messes, and waiting for the day my patience would be mistaken for worth, and this was my reward. A physical manifestation of exactly how they viewed me, an afterthought, a nuisance meant to be hidden away in the dark, next to the plumbing. Any other person might have broken down. They might have collapsed into the folding chair and wept into their hands. They might have stormed back into the ballroom, grabbed a microphone from the band, and screamed until the chandelier shook. I did neither. I stood perfectly still in the sterile light of the corridor. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing slowed. The hurt, which had been bright and agonizing just moments before, began to calcify. It hardened into something dense, cold, and utterly immovable. The stillness that overtook my body was absolute, and in the empty hallway, it felt infinitely more dangerous, more terrifyingly unsettling than any hysterical outburst could have ever been. I stared at the black ink of my name, and the old Amanda Winters simply ceased to exist. To understand how a person ends up in a position of such profound erasure, you have to look backward. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical conditioning, built over decades of small concessions. I had spent the majority of my life being the daughter my parents admired in the strict privacy of our home, yet conveniently forgot the moment an audience arrived. My sister Sloane, at 36 years old, has always been the gravitational center of our family. She is the sun, and the rest of us are merely caught in her orbit, grateful for whatever warmth she decides to cast in our direction. Sloane is polished in a way that feels almost weaponized. She is persuasive, magnetic, and possesses a terrifying ability to make people want to please her. From childhood, she was endlessly rewarded for simply existing loudly. If Sloane walked into a room, the room rearranged itself to accommodate her. Our parents, Richard and Elaine Winters, are not monsters. They are not cartoonishly cruel villains who locked me in a cupboard or actively plotted my demise. Their failure was much more common and far more insidious. They are simply the kind of people who genuinely confuse convenience with love. Affection, in our household, was transactional. If you made their lives easier, you were good. If you required effort, you were difficult. Sloane was the trophy. I was the infrastructure. Whenever there was a crisis, a gap that needed filling, or a mess that required quiet, uncomplaining labor, I was the child they summoned. When the high school booster club needed 50 customized flyers designed and printed overnight, my mother would knock on my door at 9 in the evening with a pleading smile. When Great-Uncle Arthur passed away, it was not Sloane who sat at the dining room table sorting through blurry photographs and formatting the memorial programs. I did that. I handled the elderly relatives who repeated their stories every 10 minutes at Thanksgiving. I quietly absorbed every logistical nightmare our family generated, smoothing the sharp edges of our lives so Sloane and our parents could glide over them without tripping. "Amanda is so capable," my mother used to say to her friends over glasses of iced tea. "She just handles things." They praised my capability, but what they actually valued was my compliance. Being capable was my only currency. I thought I was earning my place in the family. I thought that by being indispensable, I was making myself beloved. The true depth of this dynamic did not fully crystallize until our late grandmother passed away and left us Juniper House. Juniper House was not just a piece of real estate. It was a historic, sprawling 12-room property situated on a gorgeous, overgrown plot of land. It had a wraparound porch, original stained glass windows, and a history that breathed through the floorboards. It was the only place where I had ever felt entirely at peace as a child, a sanctuary away from the polished, high-stakes performance of my immediate family's daily life. In her will, my grandmother divided the property into 3 equal legal shares. 1 share went to my mother, 1 share went to Sloane, and 1 share, explicitly and deliberately, went to me. It was the first time in my life I had been given exactly the same weight and standing as my sister. We were equals on paper, but paper means very little to people accustomed to ruling the narrative. Almost immediately, the lines of battle were drawn in invisible ink. I wanted the house preserved. I wanted to restore the woodwork, fix the sagging roof on the carriage house, and perhaps keep it as a family retreat, or if we absolutely had to, sell it fairly to a buyer who respected its historical value. I saw a legacy. Sloane looked at those 12 rooms and saw only locked capital. "It is a money pit, Amanda," Sloane told me during a tense dinner shortly after the reading of the will. "We are sitting on prime acreage. The equity alone could fund 3 different portfolios. It is irresponsible to just let it sit there gathering dust because you have a sentimental attachment to old wallpaper. She did not see a home. She saw leverage. And because my mother idolized Sloane's aggressive, forward-thinking ambition, Elaine immediately aligned her third of the ownership with Sloane's. That left me as the sole dissenting vote, the inconvenient roadblock standing between my sister and her financial desires. Suddenly, the dynamic of my childhood shifted. They could no longer just command me to fix a flyer or organize a schedule. They needed my legal consent. They needed my signature on a deed transfer. Over the next few years, the requests for my help took on a different, darker tone. Whenever my mother called and said, "We really need your help with this," I slowly learned to translate the phrasing. They did not need my help. They needed my labor, my design taste for their personal projects, or most importantly, my surrender. They wanted me to capitulate and sign away my 1/3 of Juniper House. They used inclusion as a dangling carrot. I would be invited to a prestigious dinner with Sloane's friends, but halfway through the appetizers, the conversation would inevitably pivot to real estate and the burden of holding on to outdated assets. My father would call to ask about my day, only to smoothly transition into a monologue about how much stress the property taxes were causing my mother. They surrounded me with a relentless, soft pressure. It was an exhausting campaign of attrition. Yet, despite the obvious manipulation, I kept showing up. I kept answering their calls. I designed the invitations for my parents' anniversary party. I helped Sloane curate her professional portfolio when she pivoted careers. I did these things because, deep in my core, I was still that little girl sitting at the dining room table, making memorial programs, desperately hoping that someone would look at me and see my value. I operated under the tragic delusion that if I just proved how useful I was, how much I cared, how deeply I understood them, they would eventually choose me. I told myself that my endless patience would one day be mistaken for worth. I believed that if I absorbed enough of their stress, they would finally look at me not as an assistant, not as an obstacle holding a piece of paper they wanted, but as a daughter and a sister. I thought my submission would buy their respect. I did not realize that to people like my sister and my parents, submission is simply an invitation for further consumption. They do not respect the people who fix their problems. They expect it of them. Every time I gave an inch, they took a mile, and they did it with a smile, telling me it was for the good of the family. The family, of course, was just a synonym for Sloane. Her comfort, her advancement, her desires were the only metrics that mattered. My role was to pave the road she walked on, and if I ever stopped paving, I was suddenly framed as the antagonist in a story I never asked to be part of. Juniper House became the physical manifestation of my resistance. As long as I held on to my share, I was not completely under their control. I had a boundary. I had a piece of the earth that they could not simply take by smiling and asking me to be a team player. That resistance, I now understand, was unforgivable to them. You cannot be the family servant and simultaneously hold the keys to the master bedroom. By refusing to hand over my share of the inheritance, I had disrupted the natural order of our lives. I had stepped out of my designated quiet corner. And for that transgression, for the simple act of trying to protect something my grandmother had entrusted to me, they decided I needed to be broken. They decided to show me exactly how small I could be made to feel. The trap had been set long before the invitations were ever mailed, built entirely out of my own desperate desire to finally be loved. The 6 months leading up to the ceremony were not a period of familial bonding. They were a masterclass in free, unacknowledged labor. When Sloane's bespoke stationery vendor suddenly backed out exactly 60 days before the big weekend, I was the one who spent 72 straight hours designing, printing, and hand-assembling 200 luxury welcome packets. I sourced the heavy, textured linen paper myself. I stayed awake for 2 days straight, hand-drawing topographical maps of the mountain ridge so her guests would know exactly where to hike between the rehearsal dinner and the reception. When her custom wedding website crashed because the original designer failed to renew the premium hosting tier, I migrated the entire domain. I rebuilt the digital architecture from scratch. I even diplomatically rewrote the embarrassingly awkward family biographies my mother had originally drafted, ensuring everyone sounded appropriately distinguished for the new in-laws. When the digital seating software glitched and erased half the guest list a mere 7 days out, I sat at my kitchen island until 3 in the morning, manually cross-referencing 4 different spreadsheets to repair the database and save the final catering order. Through every single late-night emergency, I was never asked to stand beside my sister at the altar. There were 8 bridesmaids. There were college roommates she had not spoken to in 5 years, a woman she met at an exclusive yoga retreat 24 months prior, and Nolan's twin sisters. When the bridal party was finally announced at an opulent engagement brunch early in the spring, Sloane pulled me aside toward the mimosa bar with a bright, entirely apologetic smile plastered across her face. "I just could not do that to you, Amanda," she said, squeezing my arm with perfectly manicured fingers. The matching silk dresses, the week-long bachelorette trip to Tulum, the grueling hair and makeup schedule on the morning of, "It is an absolute circus. Plus, I really need you free to solve problems. If you are standing up there holding a bouquet and smiling for the cameras, who is going to make sure the wheels do not fall off the wagon?" She laughed, a sparkling, beautifully rehearsed sound that was meant to sound endearing. I nodded slowly and swallowed the bitter metallic taste rising in my mouth. I saw clearly, perhaps for the very first time, that her interest in me had absolutely nothing to do with sisterhood. I was a utility, a wrench kept in the toolbox. She wanted me close, but only close enough to catch whatever delicate glass she happened to drop. The true, insidious nature of the wedding, however, did not reveal itself until I started interacting directly with Nolan's father. Dean Pierce was a man who had built a massive regional empire developing luxury mixed-use properties and high-end retail spaces. He possessed the kind of expensive silver-haired polish that naturally commanded boardrooms and effortlessly intimidated local zoning committees. He also possessed a terrifying talent for smiling warmly while applying suffocating, relentless pressure. At every pre-wedding event, Dean made a calculated point to corner me. It was never overtly hostile. It was always wrapped in a thick layer of patriarchal charm. He would hand me a glass of wildly expensive Cabernet, ask a polite, surface-level question about my graphic design firm back in Minneapolis, and then pivot effortlessly to his actual agenda. "So, Amanda," Dean said during a lavish country club cocktail hour in late July, gently swirling the dark wine in his crystal glass, "Sloane tells me we are getting remarkably close to finalizing the Juniper paperwork. Have you had a chance to look at the architectural vision boards for the boutique hotel conversion? It is going to be a spectacular, income-generating asset for the entire family." I always deflected. I smiled politely back, mentioned how incredibly busy the wedding preparations were, and slipped away into the crowd. But his inquiries grew more frequent, more pointed, and significantly less casual. The trap finally snapped shut exactly 21 days before the wedding. It arrived not via a formal, certified legal letter, but buried deep inside a chaotic, multi-recipient family email thread. The subject line read, "Rehearsal dinner parking logistics and weekend timeline." My mother had forwarded it to the entire immediate family. Beneath 3 dense paragraphs detailing valet schedules and luxury shuttle bus routes, there was a casual, almost aggressively breezy note from Sloane. Also, attaching the final draft of the Juniper transfer agreement so we can just get it out of the way before the crazy weekend starts. Love you all so much. I opened the attached document. It was a dense, 30-page legal contract designed to completely and permanently restructure the ownership of my grandmother's historic estate. The agreement proposed folding Juniper House into a newly formed corporate entity called Pierce Winters Hospitality Partners. Sloane and Nolan would hold 51% of the controlling shares. Dean's primary development group would hold the remaining 49%. My legal share, my 1/3 of the only place I ever felt genuinely safe, was to be bought out for a single, flat lump sum. I stared intently at the valuation figure listed on page 4 of the schedule. I read it 3 times to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me in the late-night lighting of my apartment. They were offering me $250,000, Even without a professional background in commercial real estate, I knew that figure was insultingly, suspiciously low. The acreage alone, situated directly in a rapidly appreciating historic district with newly approved commercial zoning, was worth easily 4 or 5 times that amount. They were not just trying to buy me out for the sake of convenience. They were trying to financially gut me under the wholesome guise of family consolidation. They were banking entirely on the fact that I would be too overwhelmed by the impending wedding logistics, too deeply conditioned to comply, to actually read the fine print of the contract. I did not call my mother. I did not call Sloan. I sat at my desk, took a long breath, composed a new email, and sent it directly to Sloan, copying Nolan and Dean Pierce. Hi everyone, I received the draft. Given the current real estate market and the deep historical significance of the property, I cannot sign any transfer agreement based on this internal, unverified valuation. I will be hiring an independent, state-certified appraiser to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the house and the grounds. We can revisit this conversation, and any associated paperwork, 30 days after the wedding once the independent appraisal is complete. Let us just focus on celebrating the two of you next month. I hit send. The response was immediate and entirely nonverbal. The digital silence that followed my email was deafening. No one replied to the thread. No one acknowledged my boundary. No one argued the valuation. Instead, the emotional temperature of my entire family plummeted to absolute zero. The very next time I spoke to my mother on the phone, her voice was clipped, tight, and completely devoid of its usual breathless, dramatic energy. When I drove to my parents' house to drop off the finalized printed menus a week later, my father would barely look me in the eye, busying himself intensely with the television remote and refusing to engage in conversation. Sloan completely stopped texting me her daily, frantic complaints about the caterer and the floral arrangements. The endless, suffocating flow of desperate requests for my help dried up instantly. I had stepped off the approved script, and they were punishing me with a freezing, highly coordinated withdrawal of affection. It was during that agonizing silent freeze in the final weeks that the true architecture of the situation became terrifyingly clear to me. The grand, expensive mountain wedding was not merely a celebration of my sister finding love, it was a perfectly stage-managed environment. It was a high-stakes psychological pressure cooker designed specifically to surround me with wealth, influence, and an impenetrable wall of family unity, all calibrated to make my refusal feel petty, selfish, and utterly impossible. They intended to parade me through a weekend of overwhelming opulence, flanked constantly by Dean Pierce's wealthy investors and my sister's flawless execution, expecting me to eventually shrink under the spotlight. They thought I would fold, terrified of ruining the perfect family aesthetic by being the difficult, uncooperative sister in front of all those important people. They needed me financially compliant, and they were actively using the most sacred day of Sloane's life as a bludgeon to achieve it. The dread had actually started to pool in my stomach the evening prior. During the rehearsal dinner, the event was held on the stone terrace of a country club, a space bathed in the warm, amber glow of string lights and the clinking of heavy silver. I had arrived carrying a large, flat package wrapped in thick hunter green paper and tied with a silk ribbon. Inside was my wedding gift to the couple. I had spent roughly 60 hours over the past 2 months creating a detailed, vintage-style illustrated map of Juniper House and its surrounding 80 acres. It was drafted by hand, inked with meticulous care, and then digitally painted to resemble an archival document. I had drawn the old carriage house, the sweeping line of the weeping willows near the creek, and the exact spot on the wraparound porch where our grandmother used to sit. I had it professionally mounted and set in a heavy, custom-milled oak frame. I intended it to be a bridge. It was my way of tying our shared family history to the future they were building, an olive branch offered through the only language I truly knew how to speak. When the dinner wound down and people began mingling near the bar, I approached my sister. She was wearing a stunning tailored white jumpsuit, laughing brightly with one of Nolan's aunts. I waited for a lull, stepped forward, and handed her the heavy package. She tore the paper away, She stared at the framed map for perhaps 4 seconds. "Thank you," she said. Her voice lacked any inflection. It was entirely flat, hollow, and devoid of even manufactured warmth. It sounded like a line she had rehearsed in front of a mirror, preparing for an interaction she viewed strictly as a chore. She did not smile. She did not point out the intricate details. She simply turned, walked over to the gift table, and instead of placing it upright where the other presents were displayed, she slid it onto the floor. She left it leaning haphazardly behind the draped table, wedged tightly against a stack of black, heavy-duty speaker cases belonging to the audio-visual team. I watched the oak frame disappear into the shadows of the equipment, and a cold shiver washed over the back of my neck. Now, 24 hours later, standing in the fluorescent glare of the service corridor next to my white folding chair, that shiver morphed into a suffocating, undeniable reality. I looked out through the arched doorway into the main reception hall. The space was enormous, easily accommodating the 250 guests. From my vantage point next to the swinging kitchen doors, I began to take a forensic inventory of the room. If space was truly at a premium, if this was genuinely a matter of a strict fire code or an unexpected venue limitation, I might have found a way to rationalize my exile. But as I scanned the tables, the sheer volume of non-essential attendees became glaringly obvious. Table 12 was occupied by 3 distant cousins from my father's side, people we had not spoken to in over a decade. Table 17 hosted 4 local city council members, men Dean Pierce regularly played golf with to grease the wheels of his zoning permits. Table 8 was entirely filled with Nolan's former fraternity brothers, aggressively drinking top-shelf bourbon. Over by the grand windows, Table 4 sat 6 women Sloane had met at a boutique spin class less than a year ago. Every single one of them had a crushed velvet chair. Every single one of them had a hand-painted menu. Every single one of them had a place in the main room. The suffocating dread rising in my chest demanded absolute confirmation. I could not rely on assumptions. I turned away from my folding chair and walked back to the arched entryway, catching the eye of the wedding coordinator who had escorted me here. She was furiously typing something into her tablet, looking stressed. I stepped directly into her line of sight. I kept my voice incredibly level, stripping it of any accusatory heat. "Excuse me," I said. "I just need to ask. There is plenty of space in the main hall. Was there an error with the floor plan? Has there been a mistake with my seating assignment?" The coordinator stopped typing. She looked at me, and I saw a flicker of genuine pity cross her features, a look that stung far worse than open hostility would have. She glanced around nervously to ensure no one from the bridal party was within earshot. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "There is no mistake. This placement was specifically approved by the bride and the groom's family. We just execute the final schematic." She quickly moved away, disappearing into the crowd before I could ask another question. I stood near the entrance, a ghost haunting the edges of a celebration. My eyes drifted to a tall, clear acrylic podium, positioned slightly behind the main entry doors, mostly hidden by a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas. It was the master control station for the planning team. Resting on top of it was a thick black leather binder, left half open. The area was momentarily clear. Guests were busy finding their seats and ordering their first drinks. I moved silently toward the podium, stepping behind the floral arrangement, and looked down at the open pages. It was the master seating matrix. It was a massive, color-coded spreadsheet printed on oversized legal paper. The guests were listed alphabetically, with columns designating their table number, dietary restrictions, and special status. I found my row. The column for my table number was completely blank. The column for my dietary restrictions was marked with a simple dash, but it was the final column, a wide section labeled Planner Notes, that finally broke the dam. Printed there, in bold, red, capitalized letters, was a direct instruction. Overflow corridor. Keep separate from family photo zone. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to lead. The folding chair by the bathrooms had been a physical humiliation. A deeply uncomfortable slap in the face. But this note, these 7 specific words, hit me with the force of a high-speed collision. Keep separate from family photo zone. The objective was not merely to sideline me during the dinner service. The objective was not just to make me feel small or insignificant while people ate their roasted filet mignon. The true goal was total, absolute erasure. Sloane and Dean Pierce knew that the visual narrative of this wedding would be documented by 3 separate luxury photographers and a high-end videography team. They knew these images would be curated into leather-bound albums, published in regional lifestyle magazines, and blasted across hundreds of social media profiles. By mandating that I be kept out of the family photo zone, they were meticulously ensuring that I would not exist in the historical record of this event. When the albums were printed, when the framed photos were hung in the hallways of their future homes, there would be no evidence that the bride even had a sister. I was being surgically excised from the family tree. The sheer calculation required to draft that note, to review it with a planner, and to approve it for execution was staggering. It required a level of cold, reptilian detachment that I had never fully allowed myself to believe my family possessed. I traced the red letters with my eyes one last time, memorizing the shape of my own banishment. In that brutal, isolating instant, the final veil dropped. I was not invited to this mountain estate as a member of the family. I was not invited as a guest to witness a union of love. I was invited exclusively as leverage. The entire weekend, the opulence, the strategic isolation, the withholding of affection, the humiliating folding chair, and the deliberate erasure from the photographs was all a highly structured punishment. It was a perfectly designed psychological vice meant to squeeze me until I broke. They brought me here to show me the vibrant, wealthy, powerful world I would be permanently locked out of if I did not surrender my third of Juniper House. They believed that after hours of being treated like a diseased pariah, I would be so desperate to crawl back into their good graces, so eager to rejoin the family in the main room, that I would sign any document they put in front of me just to stop the pain. They thought they had engineered the perfect humiliation. I stepped back from the podium. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. The devastating sadness that had threatened to consume me only moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by something razor-sharp and remarkably clear. I turned and looked back at the narrow corridor, at the white folding chair waiting in the shadows by the restroom doors. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt awake. I reached into my beaded clutch and pulled out the thick, ivory envelope containing my wedding card. I did not open it to retrieve the generous check I had written weeks ago. I did not tear it into pieces or throw it in the trash. I simply walked over to the draped gift table, nestled the pristine envelope squarely between 2 towering, expertly wrapped boxes, and turned my back on the ballroom. I walked down the main hallway, moving steadily past the floor-to-ceiling windows that separated the chaotic joy of the reception from the quiet darkness of the mountain exterior. I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors, and the cool, sharp night air hit my face. It was a startling contrast to the suffocating, perfumed heat of the venue. I crossed the sprawling stone patio and headed down the winding gravel path toward the lower parking lot. Every step I took away from the building felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. My car was parked near the tree line, a silent, metal promise of immediate escape. I had my hand wrapped securely around the driver's side door handle when I heard the distinct, aggressive crunch of gravel behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who had followed me. The frantic rustle of heavy silk and layered tulle gave her away long before she spoke. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I turned slowly. Sloane stood perhaps 10 feet away, her elaborate lace train dragging carelessly through the gray dust of the parking lot. She still clutched her cascading bouquet of white orchids tightly in her right hand. Her face was flushed against the pale moonlight, but her posture remained terrifyingly rigid. She was furious. It was not a wild, unhinged anger, but rather the highly calibrated, controlled fury of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning exactly how to sound perfectly reasonable while delivering absolute poison. She was panting slightly, having practically run in her designer heels to catch me before I could ruin her meticulously planned narrative by vanishing into the night. "I'm going home," I said. My voice sounded entirely foreign to my own ears. It was hollow, flat, and completely stripped of the chronic anxiety and the desperate need to please that usually governed every single interaction I had with her. "You cannot just leave," Sloane hissed, taking a sudden step closer. Her eyes darted nervously back toward the illuminated venue at the top of the hill, as if an important investor might be hiding in the pine trees taking notes. "Do you have any idea how this looks? If the sister of the bride storms out before the first course is even served, people talk. You are acting like a petulant child." "I am not storming out," I replied, leaning my weight slightly against the cool exterior of my car door. "I am simply vacating a seat by the public restrooms that was very clearly designed to insult me. I am saving us both the tedious embarrassment of pretending this is a family celebration." Sloane scoffed, a sharp, incredibly dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet lot. She adjusted her vice-like grip on the orchids. "Oh, please, stop manufacturing a tragedy out of a seating chart," she said, raising her chin defensively. "You saw the guest list. You know the strict capacity limits of that main room. We had severe optics considerations to manage tonight. Nolan's family is hosting primary investors, high-level civic contacts, and zoning board members who are absolutely crucial to the Juniper project. We needed the main floor arranged strategically to facilitate those conversations. It is strictly business. It has absolutely nothing to do with you personally." I looked at her. I really looked at her, perhaps for the very first time in my life without the heavy, distorting lens of sisterly obligation blurring my vision. She genuinely believed her own public relations spin. She had commodified our relationship so thoroughly, mapped out my exact value to her so coldly, that she truly thought seating me next to a mop closet could be logically excused as a corporate strategy. "Optics," I repeated gently, letting the cold word hang in the crisp mountain air. "So, you placed me in the overflow corridor because I do not fit the aesthetic of your new financial portfolio. You explicitly ordered the coordinator to hide me from the photographers so I would not clutter the visual narrative of your perfect merger. I am not having this ridiculous conversation right now," Sloane snapped, the pristine, polished facade finally beginning to crack under the pressure of my calm observation. "People are waiting for me to cut the cake. Just come inside, sit down at your assigned seat, and try to be supportive for once in your miserable life." I did not move a single muscle. I held her gaze with a terrifying, unwavering stillness. "I have a very simple question for you. Sloane, I just need you to answer it honestly. Do those zoning board members and local developers matter more to you than your own sister?" She opened her mouth, instinctively preparing to deliver another polished deflection, another corporate non-answer designed to make me feel insane for asking. But the sheer mental exhaustion of maintaining the lie all day, combined with the raw adrenaline of the confrontation, caused her immaculate filter to slip for a fraction of a second. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing with sudden, unfiltered resentment. "Tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Yes." The brutal truth hung in the space between us, ugly and entirely bare. Before I could even process the finality of her answer, the sound of rapid, uneven footsteps echoed across the pavement. My mother, Elaine, emerged from the shadows of the stone pathway. She was breathless, one hand clutching the elaborate, heavy beading of her silver gown, the other pressed anxiously against her chest. "Amanda!" my mother gasped, coming to a halt directly next to Sloane. She looked back and forth between the two of us, instantly sensing the shattered, volatile atmosphere. Without a second thought, she immediately moved to protect her favorite, most valuable asset. "What on earth is going on down here? Why are you out in the dirt? The coordinator said you walked right out the front doors." "She is leaving," Sloane said abruptly, folding her free arm tightly across her chest. "She is throwing a massive tantrum over the seating arrangements and trying to ruin the evening." My mother's face hardened instantly. Any trace of maternal panic vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, deeply familiar annoyance. She stepped toward me, her jaw set in a rigid line of disapproval. "Honestly, Amanda, you are making a scene over absolutely nothing," my mother said, her tone dripping with intense condescension. "You should be incredibly grateful you were even included in the main reception timeline. After the way you have been acting recently, after making things so incredibly difficult for everyone with the property negotiations, we extended a gracious olive branch by having you here today. We expected you to act with a little bit of grace and maturity." There it was, the final, undeniable confirmation delivered straight from my mother's mouth. The puzzle pieces snapped together inside my mind with violent, irreversible clarity. The folding chair by the bathrooms was never a logistical error. The placement was never a matter of limited venue capacity or innocent oversight. It was a highly calculated punishment. It was a direct, punitive consequence for refusing to sign away my inheritance 3 weeks ago. This entire elaborate, wealthy setup was designed specifically to teach me a lesson. They wanted to demonstrate exactly what happens when I dare to resist their demands. I either comply and get a seat at the main table, or I defy them and get banished to the shadows next to the plumbing. They stood there together in their expensive, glittering gowns, bathed in the faint moonlight, waiting eagerly for my reaction. They were fully braced for a hysterical meltdown. They wanted me to scream at them. They wanted me to cry, to hurl insults, and to beg for their affection, because a theatrical breakdown would grant them the perfect excuse to dismiss me as emotionally unstable. It would validate their carefully constructed narrative that I was the crazy, unreasonable sister ruining the perfect day. I looked at my mother, whose face was set in a mask of stern, judgmental disappointment. I looked at my sister, who was glaring at me like I was a bad investment she could not wait to liquidate. I did not give them a single tear. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. I completely refused to offer them the satisfaction of witnessing my pain. "I understand perfectly now," I said. My voice was quiet, incredibly steady, and entirely devoid of the blind love I used to carry for them. "Congratulations on your wedding, Sloane." I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life, breaking the tense silence of the parking lot. My mother stepped forward, suddenly looking unsure, sensing that the fundamental dynamic of our entire relationship had shifted in a permanent way she could no longer control. She called my name, but the sound was easily drowned out by the engine. I put the car in gear. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I drove out of the lot, leaving them standing together in the dust of their own making. The old version of me died right there on that gravel, and the woman driving down the dark mountain road was someone they had never met. As I navigated the tight, unlit curves of the mountain descent, gripping the leather steering wheel with hands that were finally entirely steady, I believed the worst of the night was over. I assumed my sudden departure would be spun by my mother as a sudden illness or a dramatic overreaction, and the reception would carry on without a single ripple. What I did not know, and what I would only piece together later from the gleeful, horrified accounts of distant relatives, was that my sister's absolute obsession with documenting her own perfection was about to become the very thing that destroyed it. Sloane had hired a dedicated social media content creator for the weekend, a young woman whose sole job was to capture raw, candid moments and package them into glossy, hyper-edited digital reels. She was tasked with feeding a constant stream of aesthetic dominance to a custom guest group chat and the 3 massive flat screens mounted above the primary cocktail bars. About 45 minutes after I drove away from the parking lot, the content creator uploaded her masterpiece. It was a slick, fast-moving montage set to a trending acoustic song. It featured sweeping, cinematic shots of the untouched dining room, the crystal glassware catching the ambient light, the towering floral centerpieces, and the pristine, untouched beauty of the venue before the guests had flooded inside. But in her rush to capture every corner of the expensive estate, the creator had walked backward through the service doors to get a wide panning shot of the grand entrance. In doing so, she swept her camera directly through the narrow, fluorescent-lit overflow corridor, For exactly 2 unmistakable seconds, the footage lingered on the space next to the service swing doors. The high-definition lens perfectly captured the brass sign pointing to the women's restroom. It captured the towering, canvas-sided laundry cart, and tucked tightly between them, it captured the single, white-padded folding chair. The lighting was unforgiving. The camera zoomed slightly, attempting to focus on the floral arrangement in the distance, but instead, it brought the back of the folding chair into sharp relief. The vendor-style label taped to the vinyl was entirely legible. The thick black marker spelled out my name for everyone to see. The clip was pushed live. It began playing on a silent, continuous loop on the screens, towering over the bartenders pouring signature cocktails. It simultaneously buzzed in the pockets and purses of 150 guests. At first, the room remained oblivious. People were too busy finding their seats, greeting old friends, and admiring the opulent decor. The jazz band was playing a lively set, and the hum of wealthy, self-important conversation filled the cavernous room. But a wedding reception is a uniquely captive environment, and eventually, people look at the screens. A cousin from my father's side, a woman who had always found our immediate family's dynamics exhausting, was waiting for a gin and tonic when she glanced up. She watched the video loop once. Then she watched it again, her brow furrowing. She pulled her phone from her clutch, opened the group chat, and paused the video directly on the 2-second frame. She zoomed in. She turned to her husband, tapping the glass of her phone. She pointed up at the screen, then pointed toward the back hallway. That was the first crack. From there, the realization spread with the terrifying, silent speed of a viral infection. It did not happen all at once. It happened in quiet increments. Phones were discreetly passed under tables. Heads leaned together over plates of artisanal greens. Eyes darted from the illuminated screens to the polished, empty chairs at the front of the room, and then toward the dimly lit archway near the kitchens. "Is that Amanda's name?" someone whispered at table 6. "Why on earth is she seated by the bathrooms?" a voice murmured at table 12. "Wait, has anyone actually seen Amanda since the ceremony?" The whispers merged into a collective, low hum of genuine confusion and mounting shock. This was not a crowd accustomed to overt, tacky displays of cruelty. These were people who veiled their insults in extreme politeness. To see the bride's own flesh and blood physically banished to a janitorial thoroughfare like an unwanted, infectious +1 was a breach of social contract so severe it bordered on scandalous. Nolan's mother, an austere woman who valued propriety above absolutely everything else, was seated at the primary family table. When her own daughter handed her a phone showing the paused frame of the folding chair, all the color drained from her perfectly powdered face. She was fundamentally appalled. She belonged to a social strata where family disputes were handled behind heavy oak doors, never broadcasted next to the plumbing. Older relatives who had known me since I was a child, who remembered me quietly fixing their plates at family reunions, stared at the screen with deep, visceral offense. Even several of Sloane's carefully curated friends, women who had spent years accepting her self-centeredness as a harmless, quirky personality trait, suddenly looked profoundly uncomfortable. They were looking at the raw, unvarnished evidence of who my sister truly was when she thought no one was watching. The illusion of the generous, radiant bride was instantly replaced by the image of a petty, vindictive bully. The temperature in the room shifted entirely. The celebratory energy evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating layer of social volatility. Sloane, oblivious at first, was busy posing for a photograph with a local city councilman, but she possessed a predator's instinct for the mood of a room. She noticed the hushed tones. She saw the side eyes. She noticed that when she smiled at a table of Nolan's extended family, they did not smile back. They simply stared at her with polite, freezing judgment. Finally, Nolan's mother stood up, walked directly over to Sloane, and held out her phone. Her voice was quiet but laced with absolute steel. "Sloane, dear," she said, her tone cutting through the ambient noise. "Could you please explain why your sister is assigned to a folding chair in the service hallway?" Panic, sharp and immediate, flared in Sloane's eyes. She looked at the screen. She saw the irrefutable evidence. She realized instantly that the quiet, isolated punishment she had designed for me was now on public display for the very investors and high society contacts she was desperate to impress. Her survival instinct kicked in, and she immediately resorted to her oldest defense mechanism, lying and shifting the blame. "Oh my goodness!" Sloane gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, manufacturing a look of horrified surprise. "That is completely unacceptable. The planning team must have made a catastrophic administrative error. I told them we needed an extra seat for a vendor, and they must have mixed up the labels. I will have the coordinator fired immediately." She turned, fully intending to summon the woman and berate her publicly to save face. But she did not have to look far. The lead coordinator had been standing less than 10 feet away, managing the dinner service flow, and had heard every single word. This was a professional who managed million-dollar events for a living. Her reputation was her entire livelihood, and she was not about to let a spoiled bride destroy her business in front of 200 wealthy potential clients. The coordinator stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not sound angry. She sounded chillingly calm and entirely factual. "I apologize for the interruption," the coordinator said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden tense silence that had fallen over the immediate area. "But there was no administrative error. Mrs. Pierce, I have the finalized seating schematic right here on my tablet. We discussed this specific placement yesterday morning during the final walkthrough. You explicitly instructed me to place Amanda Winters in the overflow corridor and provided the exact vendor label for her chair. I asked if you were certain, and you confirmed the directive in writing." The coordinator held up her tablet, the screen brightly displaying the color-coded seating chart with Sloane's digital signature at the bottom. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that sucked all the air out of the room. Sloane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The polished, flawless veneer completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable, ugly truth. She had nowhere to hide. Nolan, who had been standing beside her, looked at his new wife as if he were seeing a stranger. He had spent the last year believing her narrative, adopting the stance that I was the difficult, stubborn sister who was selfishly blocking the family's financial progress. He had believed the story that my leaving the wedding was just another act of petulant rebellion. But standing there, surrounded by his embarrassed parents, silent investors, and the glaring proof of my public humiliation, Nolan realized the truth. My absence was not a tantrum. It was a desperate escape from an environment designed to break me. The folding chair was not a mistake. It was a weapon, and his wife had wielded it with joyous cruelty. The band eventually started playing again. The catering staff continued bringing out plates of hot food. The wedding continued outwardly, marching strictly along its scheduled timeline, but the room was fundamentally broken. The carefully managed, wildly expensive image of unity and grace had cracked right down the middle, and the cold, unforgiving whisper of moral judgment had permanently taken its seat at the table. The silence of my apartment on Tuesday morning was absolute. Exactly 48 hours after I drove down the mountain, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. A courier in a dark uniform handed me a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The return address was printed in crisp, embossed lettering, the executive offices of Dean Pierce. Inside rested a neatly bound stack of legal documents and a single sheet of heavy cream letterhead. The note was brief, typed by an assistant, and signed with Dean's sweeping, aggressive signature. It politely expressed hope that I had enjoyed the beautiful weekend and concluded with a firm request for the timely execution of the enclosed revised Juniper House transfer packet. They had not missed a beat. The catastrophe at the reception, the viral public humiliation of my sister, the utter collapse of their curated image, none of it had deterred them from the actual objective. They were simply moving to the next step of the flowchart. I took the packet to my kitchen island, brewed a pot of black coffee, and began to read. I did not skim. I read every single line, every addendum, and every buried footnote. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for my entire adult life had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp, and highly analytical clarity. The revised agreement was a masterpiece of corporate theft dressed up as family management. But it was the attachments specifically, the internal financial projections accidentally or arrogantly included in the back of the packet that revealed the true architecture of their desperation. According to the executive summary, Sloan and Nolan's new boutique hospitality venture was not fully funded. They had secured initial pledges, but the primary mezzanine financing required to break ground depended entirely on showing unencumbered control of the Juniper House deed. And the deadline for that control was explicitly stated they needed my signature before the end of the current financial quarter. If they missed that window, the interest rates on the loans would skyrocket, and the primary investors would have the right to pull their capital entirely. They were on a clock, a very tight, very expensive clock. But the most chilling discovery was buried on page 42, under a section labeled Risk Assessment and Mitigation. It was a bullet point assessing the likelihood of acquiring the final third of the property. The text read, in sterile, black and white corporate speak. Assume acquisition of final share under family alignment pressure following ceremony. I stared at those words until the letters blurred. Family alignment pressure. That was what they called my assigned folding chair. That was what they called the isolation, the silent treatment, the deliberate erasure from the photographs, and the coordinated emotional abuse. It was not just petty cruelty. It was a calculated, pre-approved tactic. My humiliation had literally been budgeted into their quarterly projections. They had sat in a glass conference room, run the numbers, and clinically decided that breaking my spirit at a wedding was the most cost-effective way to secure an asset. I was not stunned by their greed. I had known about the greed for years. I was stunned by the absolute clinical confidence with which they had planned my psychological execution. I closed the binder. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of a woman I had met at a civic planning committee 2 years prior. Mara Ellison was a local attorney who specialized in complex commercial real estate litigation and probate disputes. She was sharp, utterly ruthless, and possessed a deeply ingrained disdain for developers who tried to bully their way through historical preservation laws. I sat in Mara's office at 10 o'clock the next morning. I handed her the transfer packet, the original will, and a complete timeline of the family's behavior leading up to the wedding. I did not cry. I did not ask for sympathy. I simply asked for a full, forensic audit of every single record, tax filing, and bank statement associated with Juniper House over the past 36 months. Mara mobilized her team instantly. By the end of the week, the financial reality of my family's stewardship over our grandmother's estate was laid bare on a mahogany conference table. The audit revealed a staggering pattern of misappropriation. Over the past year and a half, tens of thousands of dollars in expenses directly related to Sloane's wedding had been quietly and illegally funneled through the Juniper House maintenance accounts. My mother, who had acted as the informal executor of the estate's limited liquid funds, had authorized the payments. We found invoices for high-end catering labeled as investor hosting. We found receipts for Sloane's elaborate engagement photo shoot categorized as site photography and promotional materials. The enormous bill for the rehearsal dinner at the country club had been written off as a brand preview event for the future boutique hotel. They had essentially used our grandmother's legacy as a private slush fund to finance a party that they then used as a weapon against me. This is not just unethical, Mara said, tapping a polished fingernail against a stack of fraudulent invoices. This is actionable fraud. They are breaching their fiduciary duty to the estate, and they are doing it to line their own pockets. But the final devastating piece of the puzzle came from a subpoenaed thread of emails between Dean Pierce's legal team and my sister. Mara had requested all communications regarding the formation of their new hospitality venture. In those emails, Sloane complained bitterly about my refusal to agree to their initial, insultingly low buyout offer. Dean's lead counsel replied with a drafted legal strategy. If I remained resistant after the wedding, They intended to petition the state probate court to formally characterize me as a hostile, obstructive owner. They planned to argue that my refusal to sell was actively harming the property's best commercial use and diminishing the value of the estate for the majority shareholders. They were preparing to force a partition sale, aggressively litigating me into bankruptcy until I had no choice but to surrender. I sat back in the leather chair in Mara's office and took a slow, deep breath. The narrative had completely shifted. What had originally felt like a deeply personal, emotional exclusion from a family milestone now sharpened into something entirely different. It was significantly cleaner and infinitely more dangerous. This was never about whether my sister loved me. This was never about whether my mother thought I was difficult. It was a highly coordinated, legally actionable effort to shame me into surrendering a multi-million-dollar asset so they could secure their own loans. They had weaponized their conditional love, turning family dynamics into a hostile corporate takeover. They thought they were dealing with the quiet, accommodating girl who fixed the seating charts and swallowed her pride to keep the peace. They thought they had engineered a situation where I would shrink away in embarrassment. Instead, they had handed me the exact map of their vulnerabilities. I finally understood the rules of the game they were playing, and I was no longer interested in playing defense. In the days following the reception, my phone became a relentless, vibrating beacon of familial panic and manufactured outrage. My father left 3 voicemails, his tone fluctuating wildly between weak disappointment and anxious bargaining. Extended relatives, still reeling from the viral video clip, sent tentative text messages filled with thinly veiled phishing attempts to figure out exactly what had happened. My mother sent a single, blistering email demanding a formal apology for my sudden departure, completely ignoring the folding chair entirely. The old version of myself would have drafted a 1,000-word response. I would have meticulously cited my feelings, desperately trying to construct a logical defense that would finally make them understand my pain. I would have spent hours crying over the keyboard, pleading for their empathy. This time, I said absolutely nothing. I did not reply to a single message. I did not answer a single phone call. I turned my phone on silent, placed it face down on my desk, and went to work. Instead of defending myself to people committed to misunderstanding me, I began gathering proof the way a drowning person gathers oxygen. I started with the physical evidence. I had the presence of mind to slip the color-coded seating sheet from the acrylic podium into my clutch before I walked out of the venue. I placed the wrinkled legal paper, with its glaring red planner notes, into a clear plastic sleeve. Next, I secured the digital record. The morning after the wedding, before Sloan or her public relations team could scrub the internet, I used a third-party application to download the high-definition reception reel directly from the guest group chat. I saved it in 3 separate, secure cloud storage folders. Then, I reached out to the lead wedding coordinator. She had been publicly humiliated by my sister and thrown under the bus in front of 200 wealthy guests. When I called her office, she did not hesitate. Within 48 hours, she provided Mara with a signed, sworn written statement detailing the exact chronological timeline of the seating arrangements. She explicitly confirmed that my placement in the overflow corridor was a direct, non-negotiable mandate from the bride, and that the order to keep me out of the family photo zone had been reiterated during the final venue walkthrough. I handed all of this over to Mara, who added it to the growing mountain of time-stamped emails tying the Juniper House negotiations directly to the wedding timeline. The chronological map of their extortion was becoming undeniable. While I built the timeline of the emotional abuse, Mara's forensic accountants dismantled their financial structure. The audit of the Juniper House accounts yielded results that were far worse than I had anticipated. The estate had a dedicated maintenance fund, designed strictly for property taxes, structural repairs, and landscaping. According to the foundational bylaws of the trust, any disbursement over $5,000 required formal, written authorization from all 3 stakeholders. Mara discovered that my mother, Elaine, had simply bypassed this rule. Over the past 12 months, my mother had unilaterally approved over $40,000 in vendor invoices using the Juniper House accounts. She had paid the boutique florist, the high-end caterer, and the luxury staging company, all under the fraudulent guise of property management and investor hosting. My mother had effectively embezzled funds from an estate I partially owned to finance the very wedding where I was publicly humiliated. "This is a massive breach of fiduciary duty," Mara told me, sliding the highlighted bank statements across her desk. "Your mother signed these checks knowing she lacked the legal authority to do so without your consent. They were so confident you would just quietly surrender your share after the wedding that they started spending the equity before they even owned it." To solidify our position, I commissioned an independent, highly aggressive commercial appraisal of the property. I hired a firm out of Charlotte that specialized in historic commercial zoning. 2 weeks later, the bound report arrived on my doorstep. The transfer proposal Dean Pierce had sent me valued the entire Juniper House estate at $1,200,000, making my third worth a paltry $400,000. The independent appraisal, factoring in the newly approved commercial zoning district, the historic tax credits, and the explosive growth of the surrounding mountain real estate market, valued the property at $2,300,000. They had not just been trying to pressure me into a sale, they had been attempting to defraud me out of nearly $500,000 of legitimate equity. As Mara and I continued to sift through the subpoenaed communications between Dean's development firm and Sloan, a fascinating secondary narrative began to emerge regarding Nolan. I had assumed Nolan was a fully vested, enthusiastic architect of my torment, but the email metadata told a different story. In the dozens of aggressive, coercive strategy threads discussing how to leverage the wedding to force my signature, Nolan's email address was conspicuously absent. Dean and Sloan had intentionally handled the hostile takeover channels privately. They had sent Nolan the sanitized, optimistic updates about the boutique hotel, shielding him from the reality of the extortion campaign. Nolan thought he was marrying into a family that was simply eager to consolidate an asset. He had no idea his father and his new wife were running a psychological syndicate behind his back. The final, most damning piece of evidence did not come from a bank statement or a legal brief. It came directly from Sloan's own phone. During the discovery process regarding the wedding planner's contract, we obtained a log of text messages exchanged between Sloan and the planning team in the days leading up to the event. Mara printed one specific screenshot and handed it to me without a word. It was a message from Sloan, sent at 11 o'clock at night, 3 days before the ceremony. The planner had asked for clarification on why I was being moved away from the main family tables. Sloan's response was a masterclass in casual cruelty. "Put Amanda out of frame. She gets sentimental and difficult when people treat her like family." I stared at the printed text message. I felt the familiar, heavy ache in my chest, the ghost of the sister I had always tried to love. But the ache faded almost instantly, replaced by the cool, metallic satisfaction of absolute competence. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to a woman who viewed my desire for family as a tactical weakness to be exploited. Mara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a lawyer holding an unbeatable hand. "We have them, Amanda. We have the fraud, the breach of duty, the deliberate emotional distress tied to a financial transaction. I can draft the injunctions this afternoon. We can freeze the estate accounts, halt their venture financing, and serve your mother and sister by Friday." I looked at the meticulously organized binders of evidence stacked on her mahogany desk. I had the power to detonate their lives immediately. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of urgency. "Do not send it yet." Mara looked surprised. "Why wait? They are operating under the assumption that they have won. The sooner we strike, the faster we dismantle their financing." "Because timing is a crucial part of dignity," I replied, carefully placing the printed text message back into its designated folder. "If we serve them now, behind closed doors, they will spin it. Sloan will cry to her investors, claim I am a jealous, unstable sister trying to ruin her honeymoon phase. My mother will play the victim. They will handle it in private, and they will never actually feel the consequences of what they built." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "They wanted an audience for my humiliation," I said, It is only fair that I provide them with an audience for their collapse. We wait. For the first time in my 34 years of existence, I felt a profound, unshakable peace. I was no longer striving to be seen. I was no longer trying to be understood by people who were fiercely, financially committed to misunderstanding me. I had stopped reacting to their narrative, and I had quietly, systematically, begun writing my own. I walked out of Mara's office and into the bright city sunlight, holding all the cards, perfectly willing to wait for the exact right moment to lay them on the table. Public embarrassment is a funny thing. For someone with a functioning conscience, it brings a sense of humility. For my sister, it acted as a highly combustible accelerant. The viral reception footage did not force Sloane into quiet reflection or prompt a sudden wave of familial guilt. It simply enraged her. To her, I was not a victim of her calculated cruelty. I was the ungrateful villain who had successfully sabotaged her perfect, magazine-worthy rollout. So, instead of retreating into the shadows to let the scandal die down, she aggressively doubled down. Exactly 6 weeks after the disastrous wedding, elegant, thick cardstock invitations arrived at the offices of every major developer, preservation board member, and wealthy socialite across the county. The event was billed as the Juniper House Reimagined Investor Gala. It was a brilliantly terrifying counteroffensive. She rented out a lavish, modern downtown art space with exposed brick and massive skylights. The stated goal was to unveil the spectacular architectural renderings of the boutique hotel, secure the final soft financial commitments from the primary investors, and present a bulletproof, dazzling image of United Family stewardship to the local press. She was actively forcing the issue into the public square, daring anyone to question her authority. Sloane's logic was brutally transparent. She assumed I would choose one of two predictable paths. Either I would stay away, paralyzed by the social awkwardness of facing the people who had witnessed my humiliation, which would allow her to paint my absence as petty, jealous estrangement, or I would attend and quietly fold under the heavy, scrutinizing gaze of wealthy investors and prominent civic leaders. She was betting her entire financial future on my lifelong habit of shrinking to avoid making a scene. The psychological siege from my parents began 12 days before the gala. My mother called on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was brittle, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth, ringing with the hollow authority of a disappointed corporate manager. "You need to be there," my mother demanded, bypassing any standard greeting. "The investors need to see a united front. This is your absolute last chance to repair what you damaged at the reception. If you ruin this night, if you embarrass your sister in front of Dean Pierce's colleagues again, you are entirely cut off from this family." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my actions. I simply said, "I hear you," and disconnected the line. The following afternoon, my father called. Richard Winters had spent his entire 30-year marriage taking the path of least resistance, allowing his wife and eldest daughter to dictate the emotional weather of our household. He sounded incredibly exhausted. "Please just come and smile," my father begged, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, clearly hiding in his private study so my mother would not hear him. "Do not humiliate the family further. You know how much is riding on this. The loans, the property structure, just sign the papers and let it go. We cannot take another public disaster." His plea was pathetic, but it was also a massive, accidental confession. He said the loans, the property structure. He knew. He had known about the fraudulent spending and the coercive financial strategy all along. He was not an innocent bystander. He was a silent accomplice who actively prioritized his own domestic comfort over my basic dignity. But the true shift in the tectonic plates occurred 3 days later. My phone buzzed with an unknown local number. I answered cautiously. It was Nolan. He did not sound like the arrogant, polished heir to a regional real estate empire. He sounded deeply rattled, his voice tight and uncertain. He asked for a conversation. He explicitly stated he did not want a negotiation, but a private conversation. We met at a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop in a neutral part of the city. miles away from the exclusive country clubs and the gated mountain estates where his family usually operated. He arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a dark wool coat, looking pale and noticeably sleep-deprived. He sat across from me and did not even bother to order a drink. "Sloan is telling everyone you are having a severe mental breakdown," Nolan said quietly, leaning his forearms over the small wooden table. "My father says you are trying to extort the family out of spite because you are jealous of the marriage. But after what I saw at the reception, after that folding chair by the bathrooms, I do not believe them anymore. What is actually going on?" I looked at my new brother-in-law. I saw a man who had been managed just as thoroughly and as coldly as I had been. He was the golden ticket, the primary source of the crucial mezzanine financing, and his own family had kept him completely in the dark regarding the dirty mechanics of their acquisition strategy. I reached into my leather tote bag. I did not bring the full mountain of forensic evidence Mara and I had assembled. I only brought exactly what was necessary to collapse his certainty. I slid a single thin manila folder across the table. "I am not going to argue with you, Nolan," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of any malice. "I am just going to show you how your wife and your father do business." He opened the folder. Inside were 3 specific documents. The first was the independent commercial appraisal valuing Juniper House at $2,300,000, starkly contradicting the $1,200,000 valuation his father had presented to him in the official business plan. The second was a highlighted bank ledger showing the tens of thousands of dollars of estate maintenance funds my mother had illegally funneled into his luxury wedding expenses without my required authorization. But the third document was the absolute kill shot. It was a printed email chain between Sloan and Dean Pierce, dated 4 months before the wedding ceremony. Nolan read the highlighted text. It was a message from his own father, explicitly advising Sloan on how to legally and emotionally isolate me. "Keep Nolan out of this specific channel," Dean had written in black and white. "He is too soft on the family unity angle. We need to squeeze Amanda hard, and he will just get in the way of the necessary pressure." Sloan's reply was printed directly underneath. "Agreed. I will manage Nolan. You handle the legal squeeze." I watched the blood completely drain from Nolan's face. He stared at the printed words, the undeniable, physical proof that his own father and his new wife viewed him not as a respected partner, but as a financial asset to be handled and manipulated. The entire foundation of his marriage, barely 6 weeks old, fractured right in front of my eyes. He closed the folder. His hands were shaking slightly. "They lied to me about everything," he whispered, staring blankly at the scarred surface of the coffee table. "The valuation, the funding, the way they treated you. They built this entire boutique venture on a foundation of outright fraud and emotional extortion," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And they fully expect you to blindly write the massive checks to cover their tracks." Nolan looked up at me. His expression caught somewhere between profound embarrassment and rising, quiet fury. "Are you going to the gala on Friday?" he asked. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "I am." He nodded slowly, processing the immense gravity of what was about to happen. He slid the manila folder back across the table, ensuring the documents were perfectly aligned. He stood up, buttoned his heavy coat, and walked out of the coffee shop without saying another word. The board was now perfectly set. Sloan had built a magnificent, high-stakes arena, assuming I would step into it as a frightened, apologetic daughter desperate to buy back my family's conditional love. She had absolutely no idea that I was walking into her trap not to seek peace, but as an equal co-owner, armed with irrefutable forensic documents and a lawyer who had already finalized the corporate injunctions. The pressure cooker was completely sealed, the heat was turned up to maximum, and my sister had arrogantly locked herself inside with me. The Juniper House Reimagined Investor Gala commenced at exactly 8 o'clock on a crisp Friday evening. Sloan had selected the grand atrium of the city's most prestigious modern art museum, a sweeping space constructed of glass and polished steel that practically hummed with wealth. The room was packed with exactly 200 of the most influential people in the region. There were prominent commercial developers, stern-faced members of the Historic Preservation Board, wealthy local philanthropists, and dozens of civic leaders. These were the exact people my sister valued above all earthly things, witnesses with deep pockets, vast influence, and long memories. I arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal blazer. I did not slip in through a side door or hover near the coat check. I walked directly to the front of the room and took my designated seat at the primary stakeholder table. Mara Ellison sat to my right, her leather briefcase resting heavily on the floor beside her chair. At 8:30, the ambient string music faded. Sloane stepped up to the acrylic podium, positioned beneath the massive digital screens displaying the gorgeous, fictionalized renderings of the boutique hotel. She looked triumphant. She wore a striking emerald green pantsuit, radiating the effortless, magnetic charm that had served as her armor for 36 years. Her speech was a masterclass in performative sincerity. She spoke eloquently about legacy, about honoring the past while building the future. She painted a vivid, touching picture of our grandmother, presenting herself as the natural, visionary heir to the family's history. She used the word stewardship no less than 5 times. She wove a beautiful, completely fabricated narrative of a united family, working hand in hand to gift the city a newly restored historical landmark. And tonight, Sloane concluded, her voice swelling with practiced emotion, we are not just asking for your investment, we are inviting you to witness the finalization of our family's commitment. My sister, Amanda, is here to formally sign the estate transfer, officially uniting Juniper House under one cohesive, forward-looking vision. A polite, enthusiastic applause rippled through the room. A server carried a silver tray holding a thick stack of legal documents and an expensive fountain pen to my table. All eyes turned to me. I stood up. I did not take the pen. I looked directly at my sister, who was smiling at me with a terrifying, frozen intensity, silently commanding me to play my assigned role. Thank you all for being here, I said. My voice was amplified by the room's acoustics. Carrying cleanly to the very back row, I was perfectly calm. I deeply appreciate everyone who cares about the historical preservation and the future of Juniper House. However, I cannot participate in this ceremonial signing. I cannot, lawfully or morally, surrender my legal share of the estate to an enterprise that has been built entirely on a foundation of financial deception and coordinated extortion. The applause died instantly. A profound, uncomfortable silence slammed down over the atrium. Sloane's frozen smile shattered. At my side, Mara stood up. Without a word, she unlatched her briefcase and began distributing heavily bound professional dossiers to the primary investors seated at the adjacent tables, handing a specific copy directly to the chairman of the Preservation Board. What my sister and Dean Pierce have presented to you tonight is a fraudulent narrative, I continued, projecting my voice over the rising, confused murmurs. The documents currently being distributed by my legal counsel contain certified proof. You will find an independent, state-certified commercial appraisal valuing Juniper House at nearly double the figure used in the Pierce transfer proposal. You will also find audited bank ledgers proving that over $40,000 of the estate's protected maintenance funds were illegally misappropriated by my mother to finance my sister's luxury wedding. Dean Pierce leaped from his chair. His face flushed a dark, furious red. "This is an outrageous, slanderous stunt," he bellowed, attempting to wave the investors away from the folders. "Do not read those." She is a disgruntled, mentally unstable family member throwing a tantrum. I am a co-owner with receipts, I corrected him sharply, never raising my volume. The final pages of your packet contain the subpoenaed internal communications from Dean Pierce's own legal team, detailing a premeditated strategy to force me into a hostile partition sale. But more importantly, they detail the strategy to use my sister's wedding as a psychological pressure cooker to force my compliance. Sloane gripped the edges of the acrylic podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Cut her microphone," she hissed at the audio-visual technician. "Get her out of here." But the technician did not move. because Mara had already walked over to his console and handed him a court-ordered injunction preventing the Pierce family from conducting any binding business regarding the estate. "People have asked why I left the wedding reception," I said, my gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the civic leaders. "They claimed I was jealous. They claimed I was petty. I want you to understand the exact nature of the family stewardship you are being asked to invest in." Mara tapped the tablet in her hand. The massive digital screens behind Sloane abruptly flickered. The beautiful architectural renderings vanished. They were replaced by the raw, high-definition video file from the wedding reception. The clip played without sound, but it did not need audio. The camera swept through the fluorescent service corridor and zoomed in on the white, padded folding chair wedged between the laundry cart and the women's restroom sign. The black marker spelling my name on the vendor label was magnified to the size of a billboard. I did not play the video out of petty spite. I played it to establish undeniable, legal motive. The image hung over the room, dominating the space. The visual impact was devastating. In the middle of a high-society gala centered on luxury and hospitality, the stark, ugly reality of their cruelty was magnified 100 times over. The silence in the atrium was no longer just uncomfortable. It was absolute, suffocating, and dripping with moral judgment. The investors stared at the screen, then looked down at the forensic proof in their hands, connecting the emotional abuse directly to the financial extortion. Nolan Pierce, who had been standing near the back of the stage, walked slowly toward the podium. He did not look at his father. He did not look at his wife. He reached out and pulled the microphone from the stand. "I have not seen these specific documents until this exact moment," Nolan said, his voice echoing through the dead quiet. "I was lied to about the valuation, and I was lied to about the internal family dynamics. My capital commitments to this venture are permanently withdrawn. I am entirely out." He dropped the microphone onto the podium. It landed with a loud, ringing thud. He turned and walked out of the museum without looking back. That was the fatal blow. The moment the primary mezzanine funding publicly walked out the door, the entire house of cards collapsed. The chairman of the preservation board gently closed his dossier, shook his head in disgust, and stood up. 3 of Dean Pierce's oldest golf partners and financial backers immediately followed suit, leaving their champagne glasses on the tables and heading for the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the fraud revelation. Dean tried to chase after them. His polished charm entirely evaporated, reduced to begging his peers to listen to reason in the lobby. Up on the stage, Sloane was hyperventilating, her eyes darting wildly around the rapidly emptying room. The empire she had tried to steal was turning to ash in her hands. It was my mother who finally broke. Elaine rushed toward me, her face twisted in a mask of panic and misplaced, desperate rage. She stopped 2 feet away from my table, trembling visibly. "How could you do this to us?" my mother shrieked, entirely abandoning any pretense of dignity. "We just wanted you to sign the paper. We thought if we showed you what you were missing, if you just had one humiliating night sitting in that hallway, you would finally stop being so stubborn. You ruined everything over a stupid folding chair." A collective, horrified gasp echoed from the remaining guests who had not yet reached the doors. My mother slapped her hands over her mouth, realizing a fraction of a second too late what she had just done. In her hysterical attempt to assign blame, she had loudly, publicly, and irrefutably confessed to the entire plot. She had destroyed the very last shred of protective fiction surrounding our family. I looked at her, and I felt absolutely nothing. The lifelong ache for her approval was completely gone, surgically removed and replaced by the cold, hard reality of the law. "No," I said quietly, gathering my purse. "You ruined everything when you forgot that the person who handles all the details knows exactly where to look for the truth." I turned and walked out of the atrium alongside Mara, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own arrogance. In the months that followed the gala, the fallout was swift and absolute. Dean Pierce's development firm faced a massive civic inquiry, forcing him to step down from his own board. Nolan filed for a swift, quiet annulment. With the fraudulent spending exposed and the legal injunctions firmly in place, I forced a proper, brutal accounting of the estate. My mother and sister, drowning in legal fees and public disgrace, were financially paralyzed. 8 months later, I bought out their weakened, depreciated shares for pennies on the dollar, backed by a legitimate ethical preservation partnership I had built from the ground up. Today, Juniper House is fully restored. It is not a sterile, corporate boutique hotel. It operates as a thriving, independent artist's residency and historical retreat, a place that honors the past rather than liquidating it. I walk through those 12 beautiful rooms with my head held high, knowing the truth. I never needed to beg for a folding chair at my sister's table, because I was always meant to own the entire room. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on the video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.